Every 80 years, America has torn itself apart. Not randomly, not by accident, but following a pattern so consistent that historians have been tracking it for decades. The 1780s, the 1860s, the 1940s, and now the 2020s. If this pattern holds, we're now living through what researchers call the fourth turn of that wheel. And this time, the data suggests something unusual, something potentially worse. Because historically, crises have come one at a time. A war, a depression, a revolution, one thing, then recovery. But roughly every 80 years, the evidence shows they've all come at once. And for the first time since World War II, multiple indicators suggest that every major cycle, debt, politics, generations, currency, empire, may be peaking simultaneously. We're in year 80 of the current cycle. You're not watching history from the outside. You're inside it. Here's what most analyses are missing. You've probably heard people say things feel different now, that politics feels broken, that the economy doesn't make sense, that your money buys less every month, that the world feels like it's spinning towards something. Those instincts may be right, but perhaps not for the reasons most people think. Most people look at what's happening, the division, the debt, the dysfunction, and they think it's new. They blame social media, or one party, or bad luck. But the historical record suggests none of this is new. None of it. What you're experiencing has names. Historians call it a fourth turning. Economists call it a debt supercycle peak. Geopoliticians call it hegemonic transition. Different names, but they may be describing the same underlying phenomenon. Roughly every 80 years, about the length of a long human life, America appears to reset. Not gently, historically it's been violent. The institutions that defined one era collapse. The rules that everyone followed stop working. The people in power lose control, and something new emerges from the wreckage. This isn't mysticism. This isn't conspiracy. This is pattern recognition across 250 years of documented history. And here's the part that warrants attention. Usually these cycles appear to hit one at a time. You get a financial crisis, then recovery, then maybe a political crisis a decade later, then recovery. But roughly once per century, the data suggests they sync up. The debt bubble peaks. The political system fractures. The generation that remembers the last crisis dies off. The currency loses credibility. The empire overextends. All at once. The last time this appeared to happen? The 1930s and 40s. Depression, World War, complete transformation of the global order. Before that, the 1850s and 60s. Financial panic, Civil War, complete transformation of the American system. Before that, the 1770s and 80s. Economic collapse, revolution, the birth of the nation itself. Every time the old world died, every time something new was born. If history is any guide, we may be next. Let me show you the evidence. Let's start with the cycle that may drive all the others. Generations. In 1997, two historians named William Strauss and Neil Howe published a book called The Fourth Turning. Their thesis was controversial but intriguing. History doesn't move in a line. It moves in a circle. An 80-year circle divided into 4 phases, each lasting about 20 years. Phase 1, high order and conformity. Strong institutions, think the 1950s. Phase 2, awakening, rebellion against order. Individualism rises, think the 1960s and 70s. Phase 3, unraveling, institutions weaken, cynicism grows. Think the 1980s through 2000s. Phase 4, crisis. Everything breaks. Everything transforms. According to this theory, that's where we are now. Strauss and Howe didn't just theorize this. They mapped it across 4 centuries of Anglo-American history, and the pattern appeared to hold. Every time. The American Revolution, fourth turning. The Civil War, fourth turning. World War II, fourth turning. Each one came roughly 80 years after the last. Each one was preceded by similar conditions. Rising individualism, weakening institutions, growing polarization, loss of shared purpose. Each one was fought by a young generation with no memory of the last crisis, led by an older generation that grew up during the last high. Does any of this sound familiar? Here's what makes this framework different from typical political analysis. It's not about policy. It's not about ideology. It's about who's alive and who remembers what. Right now, the last generation that lived through World War II as adults is dying. The people who remember what a true existential crisis feels like, what sacrifice looks like, what unity requires, are leaving the stage. They're being replaced by generations that have known mostly stability, mostly prosperity, mostly unraveling. This isn't a criticism of younger generations. It's a structural observation. In this theory, every fourth turning in history happened when the generation with crisis memory died off and left the world to people who had never seen the wheel turn. We forget, then we repeat. And right now, the boomers are aging out. Gen X is entering leadership. Millennials are becoming the establishment. Gen Z is coming of age. According to the theory, this exact generational alignment, crisis generation dying, prophet generation leading, hero generation coming of age, has preceded every American transformation. It preceded the Revolution, it preceded the Civil War, it preceded World War II. The pattern suggests it may be happening again right now. But generations don't crash systems by themselves. They need fuel. And that fuel, debt. Ray Dalio is a billionaire investor who spent 40 years studying economic history. Not just decades, centuries. He wanted to answer one question. Why do empires rise and fall? His conclusion, debt plays a central role. Not just any debt. Long-term debt cycles that tend to last about 75 to 100 years. Here's how the model works. At the start of a cycle, a nation has low debt and high productivity. It produces more than it consumes. It saves, it builds, it innovates. Its currency is trusted, its bonds are solid, capital flows in. This creates prosperity, and prosperity creates confidence. And confidence creates borrowing. At first, the borrowing is productive. You borrow to build factories, to fund research, to win wars. Debt grows, but so does the ability to repay it. But then something tends to shift. As time passes, the borrowing becomes less productive. You borrow to maintain lifestyle, not to create growth. You borrow to pay off old debt. You borrow to fund consumption, not investment. Debt grows faster than the ability to repay it. For a while, this can work. Interest rates are low. Creditors trust you. The music keeps playing. But eventually, according to this model, you hit a wall. Debt service, just paying the interest, consumes so much revenue that little is left for investment. Growth slows. Creditors get nervous. Interest rates rise. More revenue goes to interest. Less goes to everything else. Economists call this a debt trap. And by several measures, America appears to be in one right now. Consider these numbers. In 1980, total U.S. debt, government, corporate, household, was about 140% of GDP. By 2000, it was 250%. By 2008, it was 350%. Today in 2025, over 300%. The federal debt alone has passed $36 trillion. Interest payments on that debt are now over $1 trillion per year. That's more than the defense budget, more than Medicare. We're paying $1 trillion a year in interest, and the debt is still growing. Many economists argue this trajectory is unsustainable, that it's not fixable with normal politics, that it represents the mathematical end of a cycle. But here's what may make it even more challenging. Historically, fourth turnings were resolved in part by inflating away the debt. You devalue the currency. You make the debt worth less in real terms. Creditors take the hit. Debtors get relief. This works if you have room to inflate. But we've already been inflating for 15 years. Interest rates were at zero for most of the 2010s. The Fed printed roughly $9 trillion between 2008 and 2022. Many of the traditional tools have already been deployed, and we're still stuck. The debt cycle appears to be peaking. The generational cycle appears to be turning. And both may be syncing with something even more consequential. The political cycle. Here's a pattern that few people discuss openly. Roughly every 80 years in American history, the political system hasn't just strained. It has broken. 1780s, the Articles of Confederation failed. The Constitutional Convention created an entirely new government. Not a reform, a replacement. 1860s, the two-party system collapsed into civil war. 620,000 Americans died. The country was literally reconstructed. 1940s, the old order, isolationist, laissez-faire, decentralized, died. A new order, interventionist, regulated, federalized, was born. The administrative state as we know it was created. Each time, the rules of the game changed completely. Not just who won elections, how elections worked, what government could do, what rights existed. And each time, the transition wasn't peaceful. Now look at where we are in 2025. Trust in government is at historic lows. Polling consistently shows around 75 to 80% of Americans believe the country is on the wrong track. That number has been above 60% for over a decade. Congress has single-digit approval ratings. The Supreme Court is seen as political by most Americans. The presidency is viewed with suspicion by roughly half the country, regardless of which party holds it. But here's the deeper pattern. American political cycles tend to run in what historians call regimes. A dominant party or ideology controls the agenda for 30 to 40 years. Then it exhausts itself. Then a new regime takes over. The New Deal regime ran from roughly 1932 to 1968. Democrats set the agenda. Even Republican presidents governed within Democratic assumptions. The Reagan regime ran from roughly 1980 to the mid-2010s. Republicans set the agenda. Even Democratic presidents governed within Republican assumptions. Both regimes lasted about 35-40 years. Both ended in crisis and transformation. We're now roughly 45 years into the Reagan regime, and many observers argue it's dying, but nothing has clearly replaced it yet. This may be the most dangerous phase. The old rules no longer seem to work, but the new rules haven't been written. The system isn't stable. It isn't clearly unstable. It's what physicists call metastable, balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for a shock to push it in one direction or another. And shocks appear to be coming. Historical precedent suggests that this kind of political vacuum tends not to resolve peacefully. It tends to resolve through confrontation, through institutional stress, through the exercise of power by whoever can seize it. This is why the debt situation matters. This is why the generational shift matters. Because when they combine with political paralysis, there may be no mechanism to respond effectively, no trusted institution to mediate, no shared legitimacy to enforce solutions. Under enough pressure, systems don't bend, they snap. But we're not done. Because there are still 2 more cycles to examine, and they may be the most consequential. Empires don't fall in a day, they erode. Ray Dalio mapped the life cycle of every major empire in the last 500 years. Dutch, Spanish, British, American. And he found a remarkably consistent pattern. They rise through productivity and innovation. They peak when they become the world's reserve currency and creditor. They decline when they become the world's debtor and their currency loses trust. Historically, reserve currency status has lasted about 80 to 100 years. The British pound was the world's reserve currency from roughly 1815 to 1945. About 130 years then decline. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency in 1944 at Bretton Woods. That's 81 years ago as of 2025. If the pattern holds, we're right on schedule. Now, reserve currency status doesn't disappear overnight. It fades, slowly at first, then historically, more suddenly. Here are some indicators that observers point to. Foreign central banks have been diversifying out of dollar reserves. The dollar's share of global reserves dropped from about 72% in 2000 to roughly 58% by 2024. Major trading partners are increasingly settling transactions in other currencies. China and Russia use yuan. Some Gulf states have begun accepting yuan for oil. BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems. Domestic inflation has been eroding purchasing power. A dollar in 2000 is worth roughly 50 cents in 2025 terms. That's a significant erosion. Now, is the dollar going to collapse next week? Almost certainly not. Probably not next year. Maybe not this decade. But the trend appears clear. The trajectory appears set. And if historical patterns hold, the 80-year clock is ticking. This is the currency cycle, and it's deeply intertwined with the imperial cycle. America's global position arguably peaked somewhere between 1990 and 2000. The Cold War was won. No rivals existed. The unipolar moment seemed permanent. But if history teaches us anything, empires don't stay at peak indefinitely. They can't. The costs of maintaining global hegemony tend to rise. The benefits tend to fall. Challengers emerge. Allies recalculate. Overextension becomes a risk. Consider where things stand in 2025. Military commitments in Europe, the Middle East, the Pacific, all simultaneously. A defense budget approaching $900 billion that many analysts say still can't keep up with all obligations. An industrial base that some experts warn can't produce enough ammunition for a major prolonged conflict. Recruitment challenges across service branches. And rising challengers. China's economy has grown to rival America's in size. Russia has shown willingness to use force in its perceived sphere. Regional powers are increasingly charting independent courses. This isn't about politics. This isn't about any president. This is about structural forces that have historically affected every empire. Historically, empires overextend. They exhaust themselves, they retreat, or they decline. The last four empires that held reserve currency status all followed this pattern. All of them peaked. All of them declined. All of them were eventually replaced. If history is any guide, we're not exempt from these forces. We may simply be next in line. And here's what keeps historians and strategists up at night. The transition between hegemonic powers has historically almost never been peaceful. The Dutch handed off to Britain through a series of wars. Britain handed off to America through 2 world wars and a depression. The handoff period has historically been the most dangerous period. Multiple powers, unclear rules, miscalculation, escalation. Many analysts believe we may be entering that kind of period now. So what does this mean for you? Not for America in the abstract, not for future generations. For you right now, living through this. Here's the uncomfortable possibility. If historical patterns hold, and they've held for 250 years, the 2020s and 2030s could be among the most volatile periods in living memory. Potentially more volatile than 2008, more volatile than COVID, more volatile than anything most of us have experienced. This doesn't mean guaranteed collapse. Previous fourth turnings produced renewal. The Revolution created the Republic. The Civil War ended slavery. World War II built the American century. But historically, renewal came after crisis, not instead of it, which means it may be wise to prepare for turbulence first. Your assumptions about stability, worth questioning. Institutions that have always worked might not work the same way. Rules that have always held might not hold. Assets that have always seemed safe might carry new risks. Your financial position, worth evaluating. Debt tends to become more dangerous in volatile times. Liquidity becomes more precious. Diversification isn't just smart, it may be essential. Your community, worth investing in. Historical fourth turnings have been collective experiences. They've tended to be survived by people who have networks, skills, relationships, not by isolated individuals hoping the system will protect them. Your mindset, worth adjusting. The world many of us grew up in, the one where tomorrow looks basically like today, that world may be changing. Not might change. The data suggests it's already changing. The only question is what comes next. And that part, that's not written yet. Fourth turnings don't appear to have predetermined outcomes. They have predetermined intensities. The revolution could have failed. The Civil War could have gone differently. World War II could have ended in Axis victory. What emerged from each crisis depended on choices. Millions of choices, by millions of people, under pressure. You may be one of those people, whether you expect to be or not. Now, some people hear all this and think, maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe this time is different. Maybe the cycles will break. Maybe. But consider what that hope would require. It would require the debt to somehow become sustainable without default or significant inflation. It would require political polarization to reverse spontaneously after 30 years of deepening. It would require a maturing empire to gracefully manage relative decline while rising powers gracefully accept limits. It would require the generational cycle to skip a beat for the first time in documented history. It would require every pattern in every domain to break simultaneously. And even if you believe that's possible, even if you think this time really is different, ask yourself one question. Are you willing to bet your future on it? Because 250 years of history suggests the odds aren't in your favor. History suggests the wheel turns. History suggests the cycles converge. History suggests the storm comes. Year 80. If you want to understand what may happen next, when the cycles finish converging, when the pressure finally releases, subscribe. Because this story isn't over. It may just be beginning.